Hello, and welcome to the Dance Physio Podcast, a podcast designed to explore ideas and foster discussion around dancer health and wellness. We're here to challenge the status quo, bridge the gap between dance science and the studio, and help change the landscape of the dance industry for the better. I'm your host, Erika Mayall, a dancer turned physiotherapist who is deeply passionate about leaving the dance world better than I found it. I'm so glad you're here. Let's get started.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Dance Physio Podcast. I am your host, Erika Mayall. Today, we are going to talk about foot stretchers, and this was not the podcast topic that I had planned, but just a few things lined up, and it felt like this was something that I needed to do, and it was sort of the right time. So, before we get into today's episode, if you have not listened to last week's podcast episode, so that's episode 56, all about form versus function for the foot, I would really encourage you to pause this episode right now, go back, listen to episode 56, and then come back and listen to this episode, because this episode really just follows on a little bit with what we talked about last week. So today's going to be short because I don't have a ton to say on this that's different than what I said last week, but I felt like it was really important for a couple of reasons that I'll get into in a second to specifically touch on foot stretchers separate to that conversation on form versus function. And one of the things that precipitated me wanting to do this podcast and wanting to do it today is that I've been getting a couple of messages over the last few days from people asking questions about foot stretchers and specifically raising alarm bells, we will say, about a post that was circulated on social media. I'm not going to name the account, but let's just say that this is a large dance account, close to 1 million followers on Instagram, and they don't always have the best track record when it comes to promoting dancer health and wellness. And I don't think that they are intentionally trying to harm dancers or anything like that, but they are very guilty of continuing to perpetuate a lot of tradition and practices in the dance industry that those of us in the dance medicine and science world are really trying to, raise awareness and educate people on, and that they are not the safest practices. So this isn't the first time that this account has posted things that are maybe harmful to the dance community. And this post, although not specifically about foot stretchers, and it wasn't actually even them, promoting the use of foot stretchers necessarily, it was a partner post that they had done, or I don't know if it was a partner post, but a post that they had done promoting a company that sells equipment for dancers, some of which is a foot stretcher. And so they had sort of like promoted this post or posted this post to say, hey, look, they're having a Black Friday sale or whatever the post was. I didn't even pay that much attention. And in it, there's a lot of like footage of people using a foot stretcher and sort of like, it could be mistaken for them, or people could perceive it as this account endorsing the use of foot stretchers. So a bunch of people kind of like sent me this post in my DMs and were like, hey, what do you think about this? Or, another red flag coming from the same account. A bunch of us in the dance medicine and science community, we send each other these messages all the time when we see things that are questionable being circulated on social media. So this wasn't any different. But then I also had a parent reaching out and asking me, I think people are starting to like put together Christmas lists and things like that. And so I had a parent reach out and say, hey, this is on my dancer's wish list for Christmas. Like, can you recommend a brand? And I was like, all right, it is time to address this topic. So we are going to talk today about foot stretchers and sort of why we may or may not recommend the use of foot stretchers. And for those of you who might not be totally familiar with what I'm talking about, when I'm talking about foot stretchers, these are sort of devices or contraptions that are designed to try and increase a dancer's arch. And so they come in all sorts of different, sort of iterations now. Different companies are making different models of them, but they are some sort of a version of a slab or a piece of wood, or sometimes they're plastic that might have like a molded arch on it. It might have, like just be more of like a flat surface. And then there's something that like adheres the dancer's foot to it. So sometimes it's like an elastic band, sometimes a little pouch you slide your foot into. There's all sorts of different styles, but essentially these are devices that are designed to try and, quote unquote, increase a dancer's arch. Back in the olden days, I'm going to age myself here for a minute, but like back when I was dancing, these devices did not exist. Nobody had like realized, oh, maybe I can make some money off this and market this. But this idea of wanting to like increase the arch of your foot or improve your foot or use some sort of external force is not foreign. We just did it in like even more unsafe ways. And so you'll hear loads of stories from dancers from like previous generations who used to just like shove their feet underneath like the edge of a couch or something, like put something heavy on top of the ends of their feet and try and force their feet down to get your toes to touch the floor when you were pointing your feet, and then sit there and like watch TV or whatever. So if any dancers are listening to this, feel free to go ask your teachers what they used to do back in the day, because I'm sure they will have stories for you, and the edge of a couch is going to be a really, really common one. But because we live in a capitalist society, people have now designed and marketed devices that are sort of aimed at doing the same thing in a variety of different contraptions, and some are more extreme looking than others, but they all have that same basic purpose of trying to help a dancer to achieve that sort of quote unquote perfect point or whatever that is. And so, like I said, I just want to talk a little bit specifically about why foot stretchers are or can be problematic. So, like we talked about last week in the podcast episode on form versus function, form does not equal function. And if you've listened to that episode, you know that we care way, way, way more about function than we do about form. And these foot stretching devices are usually only designed to try and impact the form of a foot. They're not doing anything functionally because they are what we would call a totally passive device. And so like what we mean when we say a passive device is you're like meant to like, put your foot in it or whatever, and then keep your foot there. And some of these, there's different brands and stuff out there. And I've looked at the kind of instruction manuals or whatever you want to call them that come with them. And there was one, this was a few years ago, and I can't even remember what the brand was, but I wouldn't name it anyway, that recommended dancers use this for an hour a day. Strap your foot in, use it for an hour a day to like, get the perfect point or whatever was their marketing. And so they're using this passive nature of like, you're just going to put your foot in, and over time it's going to reshape or remold or whatever you want to call it in a really, really passive way. And so again, they're aiming to change the form of the foot, but we know that we actually care way more about function than we do about the form of the foot. And one of the reasons trying to passively change the form of the foot is so problematic is that, like we talked about in last week's episode, our form is determined by things like the shape and structure of the bones in our feet. So some people are naturally going to have a higher arch if their bones are a little bit more wedge shaped, and somebody might have a little bit of a flatter arch if their bones are a little bit more square shaped. So the bony shape of our foot is what determines the form of our foot, as well as our ligaments and our natural elasticity within those ligaments. So some people are more towards the more hypermobile side of things, and so they're going to have way stretchier ligaments. Some people are going to have way tighter ligaments just naturally. But those are all things that are inherent to you and your body, and we don't want to change those passive structures in our feet. One of the reasons why foot stretchers are so problematic is if dancers are using them, and specifically if dancers are using them for like an hour a day, but even if they're using them for shorter periods of time, they are going to change some of those passive structures. And they're probably not going to change the bony structure of your foot very much, unless you were using it for like hours and hours and hours and hours every day, which dancers aren't doing. But they are going to change the connective tissue structures of your foot. And so specifically the ligaments are what we're most concerned about. And like what these foot stretchers are trying to do is trying to like stretch out these ligaments that determine our passive stability in our foot. And if we stretch out these ligaments and we sort of, achieve, and I use that word very loosely, the desired result from this foot stretcher, we may have a foot that looks slightly more arched. It may actually not actually look that different, but potentially you may have a foot that looks slightly more arched. But in the process, you've permanently changed the length and the structure of those ligaments that stabilize all the bones in our foot. And if you remember from last week's episode, we talked about how there are 33 joints in our foot, and all of those joints depend on passive ligament structure to create stability in those ligaments. And if we stretch out those ligaments, and when we stretch ligaments, those changes are permanent. We cannot reverse those afterwards. If we stretch those out, we can create instability at some or all of those joints in the foot, and that can lead to far more problematic issues with the foot later on down the road. So that is our biggest reason for really not recommending foot stretchers, and rather trying to encourage dancers to actively work on changing the function of their foot rather than passively working on trying to change the form of the foot. Another big reason, I was going to say the second biggest reason, but in some cases it's actually maybe the biggest reason or one of the most common issues we see with foot stretchers is people using foot stretchers often end up unintentionally giving themselves or creating a posterior ankle impingement. And so that is where the structures in the back of the ankle, sort of near the Achilles tendon area, get compressed, and then they can get inflamed or they can get irritated from compression or over-compression that's happening right in the back of the ankle. And if you're not familiar with posterior ankle impingement or you want to learn more about it, I did do a podcast episode on that as well. So that is episode 24. You have to go back a little ways. There's an episode all about posterior ankle impingement, so go ahead and listen to that. But people who are using foot stretchers oftentimes, although they're trying to increase the arch of the foot, and the goal is to really work on the midfoot area of the foot and get that, sort of a higher arch or a better point or whatever you want to call it, what unintentionally ends up happening is they just end up overly compressing the back of their ankle. I cannot tell you the number of dancers who've come into the clinic with posterior ankle impingement symptoms, and when you actually start to take their history or ask them questions about it, it came on after they had been using a foot stretcher or trying a foot stretcher. I've had at least one, if not two dancers, definitely one, who literally just tried a friend's foot stretcher for a minute. It wasn't even something that they were using for an hour a day consistently or anything like that. Just tried it, and that was enough to create that compression and irritation, which then took weeks for it to resolve. So the risk for creating a posterior ankle impingement is really, really high in these passive foot stretcher contraptions where you're essentially trying to force your foot into a position that it may not be designed to go into. So that's kind of one of the other big reasons why we don't recommend the use of foot stretchers. So really, number one, we don't want to change passive structures in a foot. The form of our foot is the form of our foot, and really what we care about is the function of the foot. And then secondly, the risk for creating other issues. And it's not just posterior ankle impingement. That's just the most common one that we see, and see it very commonly. But creating other issues in the feet by using a foot stretcher is also really, really common. The final reason why I don't recommend the use of these passive foot stretcher contraptions is that they just honestly don't work. So I think we need to remember when we see advertising for products, and especially in curated videos and things like that, you will never see one of these products being kind of demonstrated or used by somebody who has a naturally more flat foot. Every dancer who you'll see in the videos, their foot molds perfectly to these foot stretchers. And so they are, demonstrating what the foot stretcher is, the ideal that the foot stretcher is designed to achieve. But I promise you, that their foot is naturally just like that. The form of their foot is already a naturally high arched foot. That doesn't mean anything about the function of their foot. They may or may not have a well-functioning foot, but the form of their foot is naturally already like that. I guarantee you it did not get that way by using that product. And I think that's something that's really important for us to remember with a lot of kind of like gadgets and products and stuff that are being advertised on social media or just advertising and marketing in general is usually the results that they are promising you. And when you see these people and you're like, oh, look how flexible they got, or like whatever it is, those people probably already started like that. It is likely not a result of work they put in using that product, because you're always going to try and market the product in the best light. So it's just something to keep in mind is like, was this somebody who truly achieved this result with this product? And in the case of foot stretchers, I will guarantee you that that is not the case. They are picking a dancer or a model who already has that naturally more high arched form. And again, that doesn't tell us anything about the function of their foot. So when we're thinking about, okay, we want to improve the lines of our feet, or we want to improve our point and things like that, because those are absolutely legitimate goals for dancers to work on, what we need to focus on is the function of the foot. And a passive foot stretcher is not going to get us there. We need to be doing things actively, working on control of the intrinsic muscles, working on length or flexibility of muscles if that is an issue. All things that we can actively control are things that we want to be working on. There are devices on the market designed for like foot control and things like that that are active in nature. And so I'm not talking about those products when I'm talking about like foot stretchers and like, you know, us not recommending foot stretchers. I'm simply talking about the like really passive foot stretcher devices. So there's different devices. One that I often get questions about is, and now I can't even remember the name of it. It's a Pilates foot. I think it's called the foot corrector. And so it has like spring resistance built into it, because that is often in Pilates, like how resistance is being applied is through springs and like spring loading. And so it's this little like foot device that you kind of like press down on with different parts of your feet, and you're working against the resistance of the spring. So something like that is what we would consider an active kind of device for your foot. And so that's going to help work on the function of your foot. That's not just working on the form of our foot. So anything we can do to work on the function of our foot is going to help us achieve our goals if we do have goals of, you know, a better point or a more efficient foot or a stronger foot or whatever those goals are. So that is what I will say in regards to foot stretchers is we do not recommend, and I keep using the word we because this is like consensus among everybody in the dance medicine community. So this is me not recommending them, but I'm kind of collectively using we because I have enough conversations with my friends and colleagues within the field, and we all feel the same way about this. So the use of passive foot stretchers is not recommended. Rather, we want to focus on the function of the foot and things we can do actively to control and influence how well our foot functions, and not be so concerned about the form of the foot. There are going to continue to be companies that make these products, and like it feels like every time you turn around, another company is making these products. And as long as people continue to buy these products, companies are going to continue to make them. But if we collectively as a dance community can say, do you know what? Like there's no value and no utility in these passive foot stretcher devices, then potentially companies will realize that there is no market for them, and maybe they will stop manufacturing them, because we're not going to convince these companies to not manufacture them just by giving them evidence of, you know, the safety of them or things like that. As long as people continue to buy them, they are going to continue to be on the market. So hopefully this gives you a little bit of food for thought about the use of these passive foot stretchers, and hopefully anybody who is maybe considering these for a dancer on their list's Christmas or holiday gift list or whatever, hopefully maybe you consider something else instead. There's so many products that can be so useful for dancers in terms of helping with their health and wellness that I really feel like this is one of the things that should not be on anybody's holiday wish list. So if we collectively as a community stop purchasing these things, then hopefully we will also influence the marketing and the manufacturing of them. All right, that is all I have to say on the matter today. Again, always open to thoughts, comments, questions, suggestions. Please reach out to me. You can reach me on social media at dancephysioerica with a K, or send me an email. My email address is in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you have a great rest of your day.